Friends, I invite you to join with me as we take a look at Jonah chapter 1 together. Maybe as a way into the story. Have you ever held a grudge against someone? Someone's hurt you or wronged you in some way, and you've so wanted to hold on to that grudge you have against them that you are unwilling to see anything redeeming about that person. You don't want to acknowledge that they might have another side to who they are. Because if you did, you might have to start changing your idea about them. You might start feeling differently about them. It doesn't mean that what they've done is okay, or that the hurt will go away, but somehow we just don't want to move on from our anger, our resentment, our bitterness. We all know that experience in some way. And that's where Jonah finds himself in the story. God calls him to go to Nineveh, the people who have oppressed his people, the people who wiped his people off the map eventually. These are not people he wants to engage with. And yet the story of Jonah unfolds from there. And there's an invitation in this story. Go and cry out against the people of Nineveh. There's a lot of crying out that goes on in this first chapter. If you look, it repeats itself again and again, these words, crying out to God, crying out to the gods. When things go wrong, when we are challenged, when we are hurt, when we are faced with disappointment, we cry out. But the question is, who do we cry out to? Well, when the Assyrians invaded the northern kingdom and wiped it off the map, there was lots of crying out to God, and that's not always a bad thing. But there's an invitation now in the story of Jonah to go to these bad people. And here's the thing. We often want to cry out to God. We want to blame God for all of the things that happen. And we want to maybe cry out to anyone who will hear us when we have been wronged. But the one thing we don't want to do is confront the source of the hurt. But sometimes we have to do that. When you're bitten by a snake, you need an antivenom. And that antivenom is made from the very snake that bit you. And there's almost a beauty in this image. Sometimes the very person, the very situation that has hurt you is the very person or situation that can heal you. But we have to have the courage to face it. Friends, I reflected a little bit on some of the background to the book of Jonah and maybe some of the themes that we pick up in the story. And I invited us to get involved with the story and try and look at the first chapter. And what I want to do is just share some of my own reflection on the first chapter of Jonah, noting that it's a small book and it's quite an interwoven story, and so it's very difficult to look at one chapter in isolation. So forgive me if I jump a bit ahead in the story. I think that we've probably been able to read through the whole book because it is quite a short story, and hopefully we'll be able to do that as we go along, connecting different parts of the story together. I wanted to share with you my own markup of chapter 1, and perhaps maybe you want to share your own markup as well. You don't have to do so. But at the end of the video, I will also give us some questions to engage with as we look at chapter 1, and maybe you want to share your responses on the WhatsApp group or on the Facebook page. Friends, at a very personal level, as I read chapter 1, I know something about wanting to run away. Those words stood out to me. I am a conflict avoider. I don't like conflict, and so I would rather run away from difficult conversations And I would rather run away from experiences that are going to cause me to bump up against other people. And there's a problem with that, because difficult things need to be faced. And if we don't confront them, those things forever remain a barrier to our own growth. But also, as the story of Jonah will reveal to us, when we avoid confronting difficult things, when we run away from what we actually need to face, we can end up creating more destruction in the process. And that's what happens to Jonah on the ship. The sailors get drawn into his own experience of avoidance, and it threatens them. Maybe in smaller ways, we know that reality in our own lives, how because we're not facing our stuff, because we're not facing what we need to do, others are involved in our own sense of denial. Or maybe others become the victims of our own destructive behavior, our own inability to own our stuff and to work through it. And so there is quite a pointed challenge in the book of Jonah. Go to the places where you need to go. Confront the things that you need to confront. Jonah runs away from the call of God on his life, and that's something I also know quite well. Believe me, if I had anything to do with it, this is not what I would be doing with my life. It's not to say that I don't love what I do, and it's not to say that I don't love the people that I serve. I really, really do. But if I had had any choice in the matter, I would be doing something very different. And throughout my adult life, at every opportunity that I've had, I have tried to do something different. But I always end up back here, doing what I do, being a minister. The thing for me is, I love being a minister, but at the same time, I always feel like I'm a round peg in a square hole. Somehow, I just don't seem to fit the mold. Who I am seems inherently unfit for the mold of a minister. And so I always feel a little bit uncomfortable with myself in that space, because there's some things about who I am that I cannot inherently change. There are things I can, but there are also things that I can't. And so as I have journeyed further along this call that God has placed on my life, I've had to not only rethink myself, I've also had to rethink what it is that I'm called to. Maybe the problem isn't me. Maybe the problem is the way in which I understand the mold. And so that is an invitation in the book of Jonah, that sometimes what needs to be rethought is not the situations that happen. Sometimes what needs to be rethought is not the call on our lives. Sometimes what needs to be rethought is our attitudes and our own ideas. Sometimes it's our minds and our mindset that has to change. And that's an invitation in the book of Jonah. Because really this whole story is inviting the people of Israel to change their minds about how they see the Assyrians, how they see Gentiles in general, those who don't belong to the covenant people of Israel. Israel's been asked to reimagine their relationship with their enemies, with those who threaten them, and even reimagine their relationship with those who have oppressed them and done wrong to them. That's what this book invites Israel to do. In a way, it asks them to look within themselves. And within the first chapter of Jonah are some interesting questions. Who is responsible for making all this trouble for us? Who is responsible for this calamity? It's something that Jonah experiences in his own story, but as such, he represents the whole people of Israel who asked this question. They needed to make sense of what was happening to them. And of course, they were tempted to blame their enemies. But of course, the prophets called the people of Israel to also look within themselves. In the rise and fall of empires, what Israel needed to recognize is that all of the humanity is flawed, and all of humanity fails to live up to God's expectations of us. And so the book of Jonah turns the mirror on the people of Israel. It turns them away from their hatred and their blaming of the Assyrians and foreigners in general for their fate, and asks them to look at what they have done. And of course, the story of Israel is a story of a people who've struggled to remain faithful to the covenant that they made with God. It's a story of failed kings, kings who sometimes got it right and sometimes got it wrong. And in a sense, what the story of Jonah does is remind Israel that they are no different from anyone else. Their special call to be the people of God does not separate them from being entangled in this human reality that we call sin. One of the words that stood out for me is wickedness. And it's an interesting question to ask as we approach the book of Jonah, which is initially a story of Jonah's disobedience to God. What is this thing that we call wickedness? What is this thing that we call sin? What does it mean to be disobedient to God? Sin is more than just the sum total of the things we do wrong. It is a brokenness that we all share in as human beings. And so in the story of Jonah, we see that yes, the Ninevites are wicked, but the mirror is also turned on Israel. They have to face their own inability to understand the spirit that lay behind the law, and their own disobedience to the spirit that lay behind the law. They had to rethink who they were. The way in which the sailors respond to God in this passage is quite telling. They seem to have a devotion that Jonah does not have. And so this is a humbling story. It is also a story where the king of Nineveh is going to put all the Israelite kings to shame in his response to the prophetic message of Jonah. He's going to respond wholeheartedly, and so are all the Ninevites and even the animals. And so Israel are going to have to look at their own history of failure and recognize that this thing we call sin, this brokenness in our humanity, is something we all share. And so playing the blame game is something that we are always tempted to do, but a book like the book of Jonah invites us to rather look at our own hearts and our own motives. And that's really where this brokenness that we share in lies. We tend to want to look at behavior and define people according to behavior, or at least create lists of right and wrong things to do because of what they look like on the surface. But of course, we know it's a little bit more complicated than that. It is not our actions, but the intention behind them that really is what counts at the end of the day. If I have to take out a knife and cut you, is it a good thing? Is it a bad thing? Well, we would inherently say it's a bad thing. If I was trying to rob you and I stabbed you, it would be a bad thing. But what if I was a surgeon wanting to operate on you? Suddenly, that same action becomes a healing action. The book of Jonah invites us to broaden our minds and open our hearts, as do many of the stories of Scripture. I can't read this first chapter without seeing some echoes of the book of Genesis going on here. So in this chapter of Jonah, we have some echoes of creation. And one of the things that we see in the creation story is that there are possibly two moments where the reality of our brokenness really comes to the fore. And I want to maybe suggest that the moment that sin becomes a reality in our world might not just be the moment where Adam and Eve eat the apple, but it might also be the moment when Adam and Eve, in their failure, hide from God. Sometimes it's not what we have done that matters most, but what we do in response to it. Because the reality is that as flawed, limited human beings, we will get it wrong. There are times when we will hurt one another. There are times when we will be self-destructive. There are times when we will be destructive towards our world and others. We will not get it right all the time. But what we do in response to those moments is what matters most. And that's what the story of Jonah invites us to do. What do we do when we got it wrong? Do we seek to shift the blame somewhere else? Do we fall into despair? Or do we allow that moment to become a moment of growth for us? Behind the story is also perhaps the story of the flood. Somehow this first chapter of Jonah evokes the flood story in many ways. And of course, in the flood, God vows never to destroy human beings in the way that he did in the flood. In fact, God promises never to destroy all creation. God's response to human failure is going to be different going forward. And in a sense, Jonah presses and pushes this promise of God into what it looks like in the real world. Is what happens the fall and rise of nations? Is what happens the ups and downs of our own lives, God's punishment, or God seeking to destroy us because of our brokenness and our sinfulness? Or is this simply part of the fabric of human story? Is our rising and falling, is our brokenness and our shared destructive behavior not simply just woven into the fabric of our humanity, and God is trying to do something else, to redeem all of that? To somehow out of our messy and mixed up world create something new, and out of our messy and mixed up lives create another possibility. Maybe the God of creation is always creating out of our chaos. Maybe God's not afraid of the chaotic moments of our lives, the places where we are disorientated, but maybe God is always working in and through them to bring out another outcome. That's what the book of Jonah seems to invite us to imagine. In Genesis chapter 9, there is this promise from God. And it is a promise based on the recognition that human beings are created in the image of God. All of us. The book of Jonah invites us to that. One of the comments that was made on the Facebook page was that God's universal love is amazing. And of course it is. But it's also quite disturbing. Remember that the Assyrians were the enemies of the people of Israel. Remember that the Assyrians were violent towards the people of Israel. They were a much more powerful nation. And so these were a people who were oppressed by the Syrian Empire, and they saw it prosper for many years before it fell. And of course, when it fell, they rejoiced at its downfall. But the book of Jonah invites us to recognize that there might be another side to these people. And so the book of Jonah offers us a different perspective. The book of Jonah invites us to imagine that maybe even the Assyrians, maybe even those who we look on as worse than us, have something to teach us. And of course, that is a difficult thought. How does an oppressed people see good in their oppressor? That is the challenge. And is a God who asks us to do that a God that we can trust? Surely we want a God who's always on our side. But of course, the book of Jonah reveals a God who ultimately has no enemies, and a God who ultimately is able to restore us to God's purposes. That's what's going to happen for Jonah at the end of the day. I want to invite us to maybe reflect a little bit further on this chapter by looking at the questions that are there. But I want us to also just note one thing. The book of Jonah invites us to imagine the character of God through the lens of the story. God is merciful, and yet God is just at the same time. How do these two things hold together? God's justice and God's mercy. There's a call here. Jonah's called to cry out against Nineveh. Notice the call isn't to proclaim destruction at first. It's to cry out, to confront Nineveh with Jonah's complaint against it. As someone who represents a people that Nineveh had oppressed, they need to hear the other side of the story. But that revelation is not intended to bring about destruction. It's meant to bring about redemption. It's meant to bring about change. Behind the story of Jonah is the character of God. And the word for God in Jonah is Lord in capital letters. You'll see it sprinkled all over the first chapter and throughout the book. Now we know that when we see Lord, L-O-R-D, in all caps, what's behind that word is Yahweh, the holy name of God revealed to Moses. But of course the name was so holy that Jewish people wouldn't pronounce it. Instead, when they read Yahweh, they would say Adonai, Lord, because they didn't want to defile the holy name. Yahweh, God revealed to Moses, the one who hears the cry of God's people, the one who responds to those who are oppressed and broken. This God is a God that we can't get an easy handle on. This is a God who is a little bit enigmatic. I am who I am. It's a name that doesn't really say anything, but it's a name that says everything. I am who I am. And it's a reminder that we can never imprison God in our own ideas. We always need to allow God to challenge us and to turn our ideas perhaps upside down. The call of God to Jonah is to proclaim an inversion for the people of Nineveh. That's the Hebrew sense of what Jonah is invited to proclaim later in the story when he's recommissioned by God. Go to the people of Nineveh and proclaim not destruction, but inversion. That's what God seeks to do for us, to turn things upside down so that God can recreate in our lives, something that looks more just and something that looks more merciful. As we journey on with Jonah, I invite you to allow the God who we can never fully capture, who can never be our possession, to encounter us. Let's get engaged with this God and allow this God to shape who we are. Shalom.